Hello one and all, Jasper here, and listen, I feel like I have a pretty decent level in regards to my suspension of disbelief. Dragons flying around and breathing fire? Sure. Ice zombies that can chuck a spear more effectively than a ballista? Sounds good to me. But you know what I cannot accept? The fucking size of Roberts Warhammer. I mean, it's ludicrous. I know that Robert is a freakishly strong guy, but let's be real here. Swinging around a lump of iron that is bigger than most people's heads is crazy. It's something that few, if any of us, could do naturally, let alone on a battlefield. And one has to wonder though, how heavy is Robert's Warhammer? I tackled this sort of about 2 years ago in my Robert vs. Arthur video, but since I'm dedicating an entire video to this specific topic, let's really dive into the details here. First, let's start by talking about how heavy most historical Warhammers were. You might be surprised to hear this, but usually less than 5 pounds. That's right, if you ever used a club hammer, then you probably have a pretty good idea what swinging around a Warhammer would be like. Just give it a longer handle and you're ready to go off to battle. Most swords were about the same weight as a Warhammer. The difference was where the weight was distributed. The weight of the sword and balance is located near the hilt of the blade, which means it takes less energy to move the weapon and attack. A hammer has its weight near the end, thus requiring more energy to swing it around. It's simple physics. Even if we want to stretch the definition of Warhammer to polearm weapons that you could use as a hammer, like a poleaxe or a bec de corbin, you're still looking at around 7 pounds, maybe. To be fair though, Robert is a bit of a beast when it comes to strength, and aside from giants and ice zombies, could very well be the strongest person to have ever existed, with less than a handful of guys who could argue against that. Plus, his hammer was custom made by the smith Donald Noy. He didn't just pick this up at a local pawn shop, so it's very likely that it complements his strength. It would have been made bigger and heavier. Realistically speaking though, how heavy would that be? Well, it's hard to say, but the heaviest sword that many people say has ever been used in battle, though I've seen some disagreement in this, was a Zweihander made for a man named Pierre Gerlofs Donia. I'm pronouncing that wrong, I know that, but a giant of a man who was close to 7 feet tall. His Zweihander was close to his height and weighed 15 pounds if the stories are true. Using it as a base for Robert, could we assume that his Warhammer could have been that heavy? Hard to say. Warhammers are in fact not swords, and doubling the weight of a hammer will feel very different from doubling the weight of a sword. 15 pounds would be the same weight as a rather heavy sledgehammer. So if you have one of those, go give it a few swings and let me know how that feels if you were stronger. With my lack of knowledge on weapons and science, however, I am willing to say that realistically speaking, the heaviest it could be is 10 pounds. Any more than that, and I think you're going to run into more detriments for the weapon rather than positives. After all, just because a weapon is heavier doesn't mean it will hit harder. Force is dependent on mass and velocity. So if the velocity is decreasing at a faster rate than the mass is increasing, then the overall force would be less. I'm mainly just talking out of my ass here though. I'm way more confident in talking about fantasy shit. That is much more difficult to disprove, I found. So we got a realistic practical weight of 10 pounds. Now let's go to the real weight given how it looks. We only ever see it once in the show, the scene with the breastplate stretcher. A Warhammer is resting against a stagged helmet with a long shaft. At least, I think it's a Warhammer. Could also be a walking stick. I can't quite make it out, but either way, it looks like it could be a functional, realistic Warhammer, probably 5 or 6 pounds. But y'all don't give a fuck about this random-ass Warhammer that only appears once in the show and is never even used. Even if it is a Warhammer, it might not even be Robert's. You want the real Warhammer. The one we see in the pictures and art, both official and fan-made. The massive hunk of steel that's as big as a toddler. How much would that weigh? The closest we have an official replica of Robert's Warhammer is from Valeria Steel, where you can buy the damn thing. However, luckily for me, I don't have to, as it has its length and weight on the website. Total length is 44 inches, and the weight is 10 pounds, which is the same as our realistic limit. However, 2 things should be noted. First is that I believe the hammer is hollow. I might be wrong since I never bought one and cracked it open to check, but I swear I heard it mentioned before. But I am just too lazy to remember or look where I heard that. I am reasonably confident that is true though, because the damn head is over a foot long, looks to be half a foot wide. It's bigger than any 10-pound metal plate I've ever seen. Compared it to this image I found online of a man who made a 40-pound hammer, a recreation of a hammer that appears to be in the book series Wheel of Time, it seems to be comparable in size. So I think it's fair to say and assume that this is probably the weight of the weapon, given how it is depicted in official art like in the histories and lore, and is probably the lore accurate weight to what George R.R. Martin intended. With that said, there is one line in the books that really blows this out of proportion, and if taken literally, would mean that Robert is single-handedly the strongest being in Game of Thrones, the Westeros equivalent of Heracles. And what line is that? Well, it's how Eddard talked about the Warhammer. He described Robert's Warhammer as a weapon he could scarcely lift. Not wield, not fight, lift. And if we take this quote exactly as it said, then oh boy, can we raise the weight of this weapon. First off, it depends on how Eddard would be lifting the weapon. If we were to assume it's a one-handed weapon, which is heavily implied in the books, what with said Warhammer resting against a shield bearing the Baratheon sigil when Robert was getting ready for the melee, then scarcely lift it could mean that Eddard could barely curl the weapon. Now we don't know the exact size of Eddard, so there would be a lot of guesswork. He isn't ever called short nor tall, so let's go with 5'10". He could be shorter since in medieval times people were shorter on average, but that is way too much work for my pay grade. Plus, there are so many 6 foot, 7 foot massive people in this universe, I'm going to assume 5'10" is the average. Now, Eddard is probably in pretty good shape. He isn't a peerless warrior, but I imagine he's about average in the nobility class, which makes him probably a lot tougher than your average person. Let's say he weighs 180 pounds, mostly of muscle. For a man of that size, an intermediate curl weight would be 54 pounds, almost 10 times that of your standard Warhammer, 5 times for the heaviest you could even want to hammer, and 14 pounds more than our estimations based on its size. It is ludicrous to be wielding a hammer of that size already, but don't worry, I can exaggerate it even more. Because what Eddard thinks in that moment isn't that he could scarcely curl the weapon. No, he said lift. And you know what counts as a lift? A deadlift. This is probably the most reasonable exercise I could use to estimate how heavy the hammer actually is. I mean, I could use a backlift, but that seems like cheating. If we use the same weight as before for Eddard and assume that Eddard is above your average guy, then he could probably lift as much as 340 pounds. This is the real moment we get to Herculean strength. I bet you Robert had 2 squires carrying that beast around before he could quickly snatch it up and charge it into battle. If Robert was able to swing this thing at even a modest speed, then there wouldn't be a single person in the world who could survive a single blow, unless you put something really strong between the two of you, like vibranium. I think I milked this topic as much as I could. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to like and share with your friends, subscribe if you want more of my content. And until next time, be safe, and I hope you all have a wonderful day.